All right, so yeah, I read Song of Solomon and I really enjoyed it. This is the third Toni Morrison novel that I've read. I've read Beloved a couple of times, and I also read Jazz a few years ago, but I should probably revisit that cuz I don't remember it that well. But yeah, if you haven't read any Toni Morrison, this seems to me as good a place as any to start, and you definitely should start. What is there to say about Toni Morrison that hasn't already been said? She's one of the most renowned authors of the last 50 years, and deservedly so. She passed away a year or so ago, and this whole thing has actually reminded me that I need to watch that documentary about her that's on Hulu. But anyway, there's a ton to talk about with Song of Solomon, and I don't have that much time, so I'll get into the plot happenings. So this story starts with the suicide of an insurance agent, and follows the life of Macon Dead the Third, nicknamed Milkman, as he loses interest in himself at a really young age because he finds out he can't fly, and then just walks through life in this despondent haze, lives and works for his calloused and immature and abusive father who's incredibly materialistic and very wealthy. He's a landlord who would rather shake his tenants down for his money, despite the fact that they're having a suicidal episode at one of his properties, than even pretend to care about them. Then you have Milkman's mother, who's pretty meek and submissive and very obsessed with her deceased father, who she feels is the only person to really care about her. She takes refuge in these weird small ways, and one of those ways is breastfeeding Milkman until he's like too old to be breastfed, and a neighbor sees, and that's how Milkman gets his name. He also has two older sisters, and they're not very developed in their characters aren't very developed until towards the end of the novel, but they do spend most of their time making these artificial roses, which is pretty significant, and selling them to like a department store or something. So the Dead family, I forgot to mention that their last name is Dead. They live in an unnamed Michigan town, as does Macon's sister and Milkman's aunt, Pilot. I guess it's pronounced Pilot. I read it as Pilate the entire time in my mind, but that's a big biblical reference, as are many of the names in Toni Morrison's novels. She lives there too with her daughter Reba and Reba's daughter Hagar. And Pilot's got this weird reputation around town that Macon perpetuates, uh, that she's this kind of low class wino because she makes wine. That's what she does for a living. And there's also this lore surrounding Pilot because she doesn't have a navel. She doesn't have a belly button. Her stomach looks like a back, as Toni Morrison says. And that's one of the ways that Morrison uses her magical realism style in the story. But anyway, so Milkman eventually starts a relationship with Hagar, his cousin, and he takes her for granted and eventually breaks up with her, and she doesn't like that at all. Milkman lets his father convince him that Pilot has stashed this gold that they found in a cave in Pennsylvania when they were kids, after they were kind of orphaned because their father was shot. So Milkman breaks into his own aunt's house, and there is no gold. So his father tells him that the gold has to be in this cave in Pennsylvania. So Milkman goes there instead. Long story short, Milkman doesn't find the gold in Pennsylvania, so he goes on this goose chase to Virginia, and he doesn't find the gold there either. But what he does find is his own family history, and learning about his family in this way is what allows him to fly in the way that he thought he couldn't at such a young age. It liberates him, it shakes him out of this despondent state, and gives him a respect for his history, his people, and the culture. So that's a very rough plot overview. I don't even think I mentioned his friend guitar, which is a massive part of the story. but I'm going to talk about all of that now. So, the number one thing to talk about here is the theme of flight, which is synonymous with this liberation. And Pilot is the only one who's doing this right, who is flying responsibly. Even after Milkman finds out that his great grandfather he was a slave who flew back to Africa, there there are still consequences to this because his great grandfather Solomon, he left 21 children behind, including Milkman's grandfather. He also left a lover behind, Rhina, who went crazy because of this, abandonment, which came as a result of slavery and the conditions of slavery. So just like Solomon's flight hurt Rhina, Milkman's flight, or actually his kind of lack of flight, his lack of liberation, and just the lackluster way that he went about his relationship with Hagar, kills Hagar. She goes on this materialistic binge and then dies. So there are consequences to flying and there are consequences to not flying at all. And those are showcased through Solomon and Milkman, with Pilate being the model and the perfect example of flight. And this is where Pilate's lack of a navel comes in. And that is one thing that threw me a bit. And when it clicked, and thank God it did. But I want to talk about that now because Pilates' stomach looks like a back. And when I read that, I can't remember who describes it that way, but if it's the narrator or one of the characters, but when I read that, I honed in on it because backs are one of the biggest. Setha's back in Beloved is one of the biggest and most rich kind of symbols and metaphors in Beloved. So I thought, okay, this has to be significant. And it definitely is. So not only does Pilate's lack of a belly button kind of induce this feeling of self-sufficiency that I was talking about, because her mother passed away during birth. So Pilate had to just crawl out herself. So she's definitely self-sufficient, doesn't even need the evidence of an umbilical cord. Self-sufficiency might actually be the wrong word there. It's more of an independence. Pilate has this independence and liberation, and that's part of her job as well. Labor is another kind of theme of this novel. Her job allows her, it gives her this independence to be the person that she wants to be, just like Macon's gives him the power that he craves, but not in the same way, because that's bad and Pilate's is good. But anyway, her stomach looking like a back is also, it brings up the idea of time, because Milkman has this idea that nothing in front of him matters. He's always kind of looking behind and not looking where he's going, which adds to his characterization as this guy that's just walking around the world and doesn't really have any drive or can't find any meaning. So Pilot's front, her future, looking just like her back, isn't this way to say that she's like frozen in time or something, because it's also such a nod to her independence. It's Toni Morrison's way of showing that Pilot already has the respect for the culture and the people that Milkman lacks. And, it's with her at all times. She's independent, but also she's carrying it with her. Everything that's in front of her and everything that's behind her is with her, in the fact that her stomach is her back. It's all the same. This ambiguity with time is another MO of Toni Morrison's writing, and it comes up later when Milkman gives his watch to Susan Bird's friend Grace. I can't remember what her last name is, but he gives it to her because she wants to see it, and he doesn't get it back, and that's fine. And that's another way that he is able to transcend the right now and the concrete and become a part of something bigger and more abstract. And this bigger, more abstract thing is the culture that Pilot is already a part of and has already internalized. And this culture and the reverence that Toni Morrison has for it is another massive part of this story. There's a preference shown for oral tradition and song and singing, as well as nicknames and unofficial titles of streets and stuff like that. And this is where the character of Guitar comes in, because on the subject of race and culture, Guitar and Milkman are at two different poles. There are two different ends of the spectrum. Guitar is not as privileged as the Dead family. Guitar is forced to exist in this world of strife that Milkman has never known. And because of that, they have very, very opposing views on things like race. Milkman, says disparaging things about Emmett Till, and Guitar has joined this group called the 7 Days, in which he sees himself avenging the deaths of people like Emmett Till by killing innocent white people and keeping the ratio of innocent white people and innocent black people killed the same. So Milkman obviously hasn't had this revelation of compassion for the culture at this point that these conversations are happening between him and Guitar, whereas Guitar has taken a more hateful and spiteful track. Despite saying it's about love, it's not about love, because Guitar winds up hunting Milkman in the same way that he hunts these innocent white people. So there's a spectrum to the character's feelings about race relations, just like there's a spectrum to the character's attempts at liberation and flight. And on the spectrum, Guitar and Milkman are at different ends at first, but Milkman eventually moves towards Pilot's place on the spectrum, which is one, like I said, of reverence and love rather than spite or indifference. There are a million other things to say about this that I'm not going to have time to get to. I wanted to talk about a few more scenes of magical realism like Reba's Luck or Cersei's Dogs. And I also wanted to mention that I thought that this book was incredibly ripe for any kind of criticism, any feminist or psychoanalytical criticism. I think would be an interesting thing to explore with this novel, because there's a million different ways to go about it. But I don't think I have time for that. One thing I will say is that I watched the new Judd Apatow and Pete Davidson movie, The King of Staten Island, last night, and I was pretty struck with the plot similarities between that and Song of Solomon. Obviously, Toni Morrison has gone about constructing her plot in a much more intellectually meaningful way, with her references to the Odyssey and just making it very clear that she's writing in this traditional, heroic, epic style. But it is interesting how pervasive those storylines are in our culture today, because in that movie, spoiler alert, Pete Davidson's character is this kind of lost 20-something-year-old guy who, really finds himself after hanging out with a bunch of his late father's old fireman buddies and listening to the stories they tell about him. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of that, but pretty interesting stuff. But yeah, Song of Solomon, a necessary read if there ever was one.